Welcome to our midweek Bible study for the week of October the 7th. This week our text is Matthew 22, the first 14 verses. This is a parable, or as some suggest, two parables centered around a similar theme as Jesus teaches about the kingdom of God. Jesus' first audience, of course, are the Jews of the first century. As he warns them once again that their continued refusal to follow him and to accept him as a continuation of God's reaching out to them as the people of God, their continued refusal to accept Jesus and his teachings and to follow him as God's representatives would result in the doors to the kingdom being thrown wide open and any and all being allowed to come in. The understanding beyond just this word of warning yet again to the Jews brings us to understand as Gentile people that we are blessed because we have been invited to the kingdom as well, to be kingdom citizens. Let's read this scripture. This is again Matthew 22. Jesus spoke to them again in parables, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who gave a wedding feast for his son. And he sent out his slaves to call those who had been invited to the wedding feast, and they were unwilling to come. Again, he sent out other slaves, saying, 'Tell those who have been invited, behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fattened livestock are all butchered, and everything is ready. Come to the wedding feast.' But they paid no attention and went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. And the rest seized his slaves and mistreated them and killed them. The king was enraged, and he sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. And he said to his slaves, 'The wedding is ready, but those who were invited were not worthy. Go therefore to the main highways, and as many as you find there, invite to the wedding feast.' Those slaves went out into the streets and gathered together all they found, both evil and good, and the wedding hall was filled with dinner guests. But when the king came in to look over the dinner guests, he saw a man there who was not dressed in wedding clothes. And he said to him, 'Friend, how did you come in here without wedding clothes?' And the man was speechless. Then the king said to the servants, 'Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen.'" This week, again, I want to borrow heavily from the writing of William Barclay. He, with some insightful background, helps us to open up these parables. We'll look at them separately, the first verses 1 through 10, and then we understand the second. If indeed it's the second, it really doesn't matter if it's 1 or 2 for our understanding. The meaning will come through clearly either way. But the first section, verses 1 to 10, this wedding feast is very much keeping with local Jewish customs of that day. Invitations to a great feast of any kind, but like a wedding ceremony, were sent out, but the time was not stated. And when everything was ready, the servants were sent out with a final invitation, tell the guests to come, much as we might send out a save the date, though we're saying a date, but early on, we're telling people an event's coming, and then later a very specific, more formal invitation may be sent. So the king in this parable had long ago sent invitations, but it was not until everything was ready that the final word went out. And in the story, the first guest who received the invitation in very insulting manners refused to respond positively. Now we can see at least two meanings or two directions that we understand this. One was the fact that he was speaking to the Jews. These were the invited guests who, when the time had come for the feast, they refused. That stands for the Jews. For many ages, they had been invited by God to be his chosen people. Yet when God's son, Jesus, came into the world, and they were invited to follow him with great contempt, they refused. Obviously, they were individual Jews who followed Jesus. His disciples were Jews, but the people as a whole, and especially the leadership of the people who led the people away from Jesus, there was a blanket refusal to accept Jesus, or even in most cases to consider accepting Jesus. So as a result of their refusal, the invitation of God went out to the highways and the byways, went out to everyone else. The people there, in the people that were found by the servants on the highways, stand for the sinners and the Gentiles, who really never expected invitation into the kingdom. Though if you read the Old Testament, you know that God had always wanted to not only bless the Jews, but to bless others through them. But as we understand from this story, the consequences of their refusal were terrible. There's this verse right in the middle of this, but it might seem strange in the midst of this parable. The king was enraged, verse 7, sent his armies and destroyed those murderers and set their city on fire. But when you understand what happened in AD 70, when the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem, you understand the reference to the destruction of the city, the fire, and all of that. And imagine, had the Jews accepted Jesus and understood him and embraced his teaching, they would have walked from that point in love and humility and in sacrifice, and would never have been the rebellious, warring people who finally brought on the wrath of Rome. They were in rebellion against their Roman overlords, and had been for some time, and eventually Rome said enough and sent their armies in and wiped out what was the remnant of the ancient nation of Israel. But the parable is speaking wider than that. It reminds us that the invitation of God to come into his kingdom is joyous, as we usually think of a wedding ceremony and a reception and the feast. Theirs was a multiple day experience. Ours don't tend to be that long. But the invitation from God is to joy. People who think of Christianity as this gloomy, dreary thing, giving up everything that brings laughter and joy to our lives, they mistake the whole nature of Christ and of the call to follow Christ. It's a joy that we're invited to follow Christ. It's a joy that we miss if we refuse the invitation to come into God's kingdom, to experience his feast and his fellowship. The parable also shows us that it's not always bad things that cause people to say no to Jesus. He sent his slaves to call those, in verse 3, those who have been invited. Verse 5, they paid no attention, went their way, one to his own farm, another to his business. Not bad things. It's not wild and immoral behavior. They went on about their lives, about their business lives. We can get so busy with things of today that we forget about eternal things. We can get so preoccupied with what's right in front of us that we miss all that is potentially before us as we would follow God. We can miss the quiet voice of the Spirit of God because we're listening to all the noise of routine life around us. In other words, it's easy for people to choose second best and miss out the very best. Things that are good in themselves can close us off to the things of God, which are of ultimate value. We can be so busy making a living that we, as someone said, we make a living, we fail to make a life, and just miss the most important things. But we also see that the appeal of Christ is not so much to consider how we'll be punished if we don't respond, though those who mistreated the servant of the king in this case were destroyed. but it's not so much to consider the punishment as it is to see what we will miss if we do not accept the invitation to the feast. Those who went about their business, one to the farm, one to his, whatever that was, apparently no punishment, but the real tragedy was they lost the joy of the wedding feast. If people refuse the invitation of Christ, then one day the greatest pain will be not so much in the things they suffer, but in the realization of the things they missed. And this story also reminds us that in the end, God's invitation is an invitation of grace. Those who gathered in from the highways and the byways, they didn't deserve that invitation. They had no claim. They were not a part of the society that should feast with the king. They never imagined getting an invitation. But definitely not only did they not imagine getting it, but could not imagine responding to it. But it came to them from nothing other than the wide opened, wide heart, generous hospitality of the king. It was grace that offered the invitation, and grace which pulled people in. There's more to the wedding feast that we'll look at Sunday morning, but that hopefully will whet your appetite to read it again and consider what you're seeing there. But then the next section, 11 through 14, a continuation of this parable, a second parable. Either way, it's continuing with the same theme. This is the story of the guest who appeared at a royal wedding feast without a proper wedding garment. Barclay points out that this is probably built around two wedding stories that the rabbis of the first century would tell. One of those stories was the story of a king who invited guests to a feast, but did not tell them the date and time, just told them that to come to the feast, they needed to be clean and properly clothed, and ready to respond immediately when they got the word it was time. Well, there were wise recipients of this pre-invitation who prepared themselves at once. They were standing right there waiting for the invitation. They believed that in the service of a king, it would not take long for a feast to be prepared. But the foolish ones believed that it would take a long time to make the necessary preparations. They had plenty of time, so they went about their business. Again, not bad things. They went about their jobs. They went about their work. But then suddenly the summons to the feast came, no warning. The wise, they were ready. They were ready to sit down, come in, and enjoy the feast. But those who had not prepared themselves, had not prepared their garments, had not prepared their lives, they had to stand outside, sad at their misfortune of not being ready, and they had to look in at the joy that they had lost. That rabbinic parable tells of the duty to be prepared to the summons of God and to have our lives, the garments that stand for the preparation that must be made. A second rabbinic parable told how a king entrusted to his servants royal robes. Now, those who were wise took the robes and stored them away and kept them in perfect condition. Those who were foolish wore the robes to their work. They soiled them, stained them, and then one day the king demanded the robes back. The wise gave them back fresh and clean. So the king put those robes back in his holdings and pronounced his peace on those servants. The foolish handed them back stained and soiled, and the king commanded that the robes should be given to the proper people to be cleansed, but the foolish servants who returned the stained robes should be cast into prison. And this parable teaches that people must hand back their souls to God in their original purity before being stained by sin, but that a person who has nothing but a stained soul to render back to the king stands condemned. And quite possibly Jesus had these parables in mind for his Jewish audience, likely would have been familiar with them. So it's quite likely that Jesus built on this common knowledge to tell his own story. So what was he trying to teach here? A couple of lessons. One is that Jesus just said that the king to supply his feast with guests and his messengers out into the highways to gather everyone in. This was the idea of the open door into the kingdom. The Gentiles and sinners would be gathered in. But while the door is open to everyone, when they come, they must bring a life which seeks to fit the love and the grace which has been given to them. You see, grace is not only a gift, it's a great responsibility. We cannot go on living the life we lived before we met Jesus. We must be clothed in the new purity that Jesus gives us, a new holiness, a new goodness. The door is open, but it is not open for the sinner to come and remain a sinner. It is for the sinner to come and become a saint. And then another lesson, the way that a person comes into the feast demonstrates the spirit with which that person comes. If we go to visit someone, let's say we're going to the wedding, we've got an invitation to go to the wedding for a friend or a family member. We probably do not go in the clothes that we would wear to do yard work or to do maintenance work on an automobile or anything else that would require us to dress down and to prepare to soil the clothes that we're wearing. We know that those are not the kind of clothes which would matter to a friend who would invite us to a special event. It's not that we're wanting to put on a show. It's a matter of respect that we present ourselves in our friend's event as well as we can present ourselves. And as we prepare ourselves to go there, it's a way of outwardly showing our affection, respect, our esteem for our friend. And so it is as we come into the presence of God. This is not about the kind of clothes we wear to go to a church service. It has to do with the spirit in which we enter into God's presence on a daily basis, as well as when we gather with other believers. The garments, the clothing of our minds and our hearts and our souls, the expectation, the humility, the faith, the reverence, these are the kind of garments in which we are to clothe ourselves as we prepare to approach God. Sometimes in formal worship, when we come together with other believers, we may not prepare ourselves much. We may dress a certain way, but do we prepare ourselves with expectations, with humility, with faith and reverence to enter into the presence of God? I apologize for the phone. I thought I had turned that off. But do we prepare ourselves so that we can be the best guest in the kingdom's feast and festival? Again, we'll look Sunday deeper at these parables and come at them from some other directions, but I hope some of our conversation today will help you read through these again and begin to reflect on what they say to you individually and what they say to us as the people of God. Looking ahead, I need for you to know I won't post a midweek Bible study next week. We're preparing for a wedding on the 17th, and so I need a few days before to make those final preparations, final details, and I need a few days afterwards to get over those preparations. Jeremiah will be preaching on October the 18th. His Monday Bible study, which will be posted, will deal with some background issues around the text that he will be using then. So I look forward to seeing you again in this manner in a couple of weeks. May God's grace be evident to you today.